Xuanji, an allegory. Red peaches, everywhere the scene is spring. Green willows, every house in moonlight. Upstairs, freshly made up, waiting for night. Seated alone in the boudoir, brimming with passion. Fish sport beneath moonlit lotus leaves. Sparrows twit under a distant rainbow. This world is a dream of grief and joy. How can one be able to achieve a perfect pairing? So we continue with another poem by Xuanji, arguably the most important Tang female poet and Taoist priestess. For this fifth poem, we've chosen a curious piece. And again, like a lot of the poems that we have been reading of hers, this one was translated by Jiwang, I think. Okay, so what can we say about this poem? First of all, there's a curious aspect in its meter. As we've talked in lots of previous videos, classical Chinese poetry is usually determined by, among other things, line length. And line lengths tend to be for she either pentasyllabic, 5 characters per line, or heptasyllabic, 7 characters per line. And this is pretty consistent. We have examples of very, very old poetry, like the one from the Book of Odes, which was tetrasyllabic, 4 characters per line. And then we have genres which are not strictly poetry, like the Fu, that alternate, but generally also mostly stick with 7 or 5 character lines, even if they alternate them. This poem is hexasyllabic, so 6 characters per line. And besides that, it looks like your typical regulated poem. It has 8 lines, 4 couplets, and it has a lot of parallelistic couplets. I think the first, the second, and the third are parallelistic. So the only one that is not a parallelistic couplet is the last one. Anyway, this poem is titled An Allegory, which is also interesting. So the title of the poem itself, Yu Yan, An Allegory, is inviting the reader to decode it and to make a double reading of the poem. There's one reading, one direct meaning on the face of it, and then there's a second layer, a deeper meaning, which is meant to be detected as well. For the superficial reading, it's pretty straightforward. This is an example of typical female persona type of poetry, of, I wouldn't say it forms a genre, but I'd call it like love sickness in spring. There's lots of Chinese poetry from the 19 old poems at the end of the Han Dynasty and onwards, where you have a poetic persona, even older, even some poems in the Book of Odes are in a poetic persona of a woman lamenting her absent husband. But anyway, you have this really long tradition of lyrical poetry in which a woman is lamenting the absence of her couple, her lover. Especially poignant laments are made in spring, which is the season of universal love and renewal, of greenery, of birds and animals getting together. So it's doubly painful that in the season of universal love, this cosmic, amorous situation is not replicated at the level of the individual. And you know, this rhymes with these long and deep trends in Chinese intellectual thought of a correlation between the macrocosm and the microcosm, the individual and the universe, including these jarring tensions when they do not seem to be in the same wave. So this poem seems on the face of it just like those poems. It's a woman at night, awake, sad, lamenting in spring that her lover is away. Another reading, which especially becomes visible, I'd say, in the last two couplets, is the tension between pursuing affairs of the heart and pursuing affairs of the spirit. Remember, Xuanji was a Taoist priestess who lived in a Taoist abbey. Taoist nuns were not like Buddhist nuns. They could have liaisons and relationships with men, and even sexual relationships, depending on the Taoist sect and its rigorous practices. It was more or less accepted. But still, there is a tension, and we know that Xuanji had relationships with men as a Taoist nun. But there's this tension between the life of the spirit, achieving the goals of a Taoist practitioner and religious figure, that is, communing with nature, becoming one with the Tao, achieving perhaps immortality, whether it be in this bodily form or in some transcendental form or new body or in some of the Taoist heavens or grottos. There's this tension between that and the life in the material world. And I'd say that is the allegorical reading that is meant to be perceived at the end of the poem particularly. This poem as a reflection on this tension between the pleasures of this world and of the heart and the pleasures of transcending the world and of a more religiously oriented heart. Okay, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First couplet: red peaches, everywhere the scene is spring. Green willows, every house in moonlight. As usual, the first couplet sets up the chronotype of the poem, the time and place, and usually zooms out the most. So we get the season, everywhere the scene is spring. We get the moment of the day, it's night, there's moonlight on every house. And we get two images of nature which are associated with spring. Red peaches, here referring to the flowers, which flower in early spring, and green willows, which also, start sprouting their leaves in spring, and which are a symbol of lovers and of separation. It was an old Chinese custom when you separated from a beloved one to give him a sprig of willow. So we have this setting already. The background is spring, it's night, and we have the typical symbols of love and of flourishing and of beauty from the season of love. Second couplet: upstairs, freshly made up, waiting for night, seated alone in the boudoir, brimming with passion. So now we have somebody upstairs, which is clearly a woman. She's in her boudoir, in her rooms. She has applied all the makeup and perfume and clothes. And she is described through the passion that she is feeling. Again, the image of the beauty in her lovely quarters, surrounded by luxury, beauty, and opulence, an object of beauty herself, but feeling lovesick, is very traditional. In this case, it's more typical of Six Dynasties poetry, especially the Gungtishi style of poetry, the palace style poetry, later censured by the Confucians as decadent or degenerate, which focuses on this almost voyeuristic depiction of beautiful ladies of aristocratic birth in luxurious quarters. This could be an aristocratic lady. This could be a courtesan. I mean, the upper-class courtesans of Chang'an also lived amidst the beauty and splendor and with scholar officials knocking at their doors and with interchange of poems in relationships that were quite similar to the ones perhaps of the Greek hetairai or the Japanese geishas later on. So this also zooms us in. We have the season and now we have the specific house and the specific upper floor and the specific lady longing for her paramour and wakeful at night. Third couplet: fish sport beneath moonlit lotus leaves, sparrows twit under a distant rainbow. So these images of nature feel a bit weird a priori, like a bit forced, like what are they doing here? Why this reference to fish in the moonlight among the lotus leaves and sparrows twitting under some distant rainbow. And again, these are pretty traditional images. Fish sporting among the leaves has been since at least, I'd say, the 6 dynasties. The Midnight Lady poems. This has been a typical indirect reference to erotic consummation of man and women. Like this image of fish playing amongst the leaves has been coded, or traditionally been coded as intercourse between man and women. So there's an erotic element here. There might be real fish sporting beneath moonlit lotus leaves in this scenario, like maybe in a pond nearby to the house of the lady. But the image is clearly meant to evoke this natural consummation of love that the poetic persona might be thinking about and longing for. And sparrows twitting under a distant rainbow. So this is a more equivocal line. So it's again in the parallelism, you have fish and now sparrows. Sporting, twitting under a distant rainbow beneath moonlit lotus leaves. So rainbows have also been associated with, in this case from the Book of Odes, with illicit or improper pairings and extramarital liaisons. But there is a different reading of this line which would fit better the allegorical reading of the whole poem. So sparrow's twit is like Chui Sheng. Some modern scholars have suggested reading that line instead as He Sheng, crane's cry. So it will be crane's cry under a distant rainbow. This image would connect it with Taoism and would create that contrast that the last couplet really makes very explicit between the life of the heart and the life of the spirit. So the fish sport beneath moonlit lotus leaves evokes this human sensual pleasure, whereas if you had the cranes crying under a distant rainbow, this connects with Taoist imagery. It is a common Taoist trope that those who did the proper practices and ascended to immortality rode to the heavens on the back of cranes, and rainbows are symbols also of the supernatural world, of the Taoist transcendence. Anyway, whatever this couplet might really hint at, the last one clearly presents that contrast that we were hinting at the beginning of the poem between the life of the heart and the life of the spirit. This world is a dream of grief and joy. How can one be able to achieve a perfect pairing? So that's quite a Buddhist imagery. The world is a dream. It's illusory. It's brief. It's fragmentary. It's impermanent. Yeah, with grief and joy. How can one achieve a perfect pairing? So a perfect pairing, literally, is Xuanji, like a perfect couple, but it's also a Taoist reference. So how can one achieve Xuanji? Xuanji, perfect pairing, was the handmaid of the mythical goddess of Mount Kunlun in the west, the Xiwangmu, or the Queen Mother of the West. And she was famous for possessing peaches of immortality, and I think Xuanji made pills, and also ascended to heaven on the back of a crane. So we have here that the female poetic persona might be longing for a perfect mate with whom she could have a more permanent liaison, but she might also be thinking dreams or contrasting that with dreams of Taoist transcendence. So overall, quite an interesting poem in both of the reads that it allows for.